Hello, welcome back to the Beaming Quilt class and sew along. I'm your host Emily from Homemade Emily Jane, and we are now on lesson 5 of making our beaming quilts together. So this week we are actually going to be making our blocks. So we'll actually take the units that we've made the past few weeks and put them together into a beautiful star quilt block, just like these that I've finished already. You'll see here we have our center Scrappy Hourglass unit that we made last week. We have 4 Flying Geese units in the colors to match the center, and then we also have 4 background squares that we'll add together as well. We'll sew all of those pieces together this week to make our blocks. You'll want to check out the pattern to see how many blocks you'll be making for your quilt. I'm making the throw size quilt, so I'll be making 20 of these blocks, which is why I started sewing already. So go ahead and make 9 blocks if you're making the baby size, or 42 blocks for the bed size. So before we actually get started sewing, we're going to want to lay out our pieces to know exactly where each piece goes. This step is super important because everything pivots based on that center unit. That center unit dictates where we put each of our flying geese that we made a couple weeks ago. So go ahead and grab all of your Scrappy Hourglass units all in a stack, and we'll go ahead and get started just by laying them out exactly how we want them to go into the finished block. Now you'll see here I've got a nice big stack of those Scrappy Hourglass units, and then I have all of my corresponding Flying Geese units, and then a nice big stack of those 3.5-inch squares that are background fabrics. So go ahead and set these squares off to the side for now. We're going to really focus on our center Scrappy blocks and then also our Flying Geese. We're going to go ahead and match up the Flying Geese to each corner or each edge of our unit. So kind of flip through your Flying Geese until you find the right colors. Or you could stack these out much more nicely and neatly so that it's easy to find which piece goes where. Mine are not at all organized, so I'm just kind of winging it here. But you'll see how we now have the Flying Geese where the colors match up to the color in the center. And then we'll go ahead and set the rest aside for now. And then each of these units is going to get a background square in each corner. So we'll lay these out like so. Now from here we can go ahead and get started pinning. Pinning is super important in this stage because we want to make sure that we keep everything properly aligned and that we're sewing the right pieces together. So we're going to go ahead and start off by pinning this top row right sides together if you're using a patterned background, and go ahead and just pin it. I like to pin pointing towards the seam that I'm going to sew. And then I'm going to do that same thing on the opposite side here, lining up those raw edges and putting them right sides together and then pinning that way. So that'll be the top row, and then we do the same exact thing for the bottom row here. So right sides together again, and we can go ahead and pin these in place. Now that we've got both of those Flying Geese pinned, we can work on our center piece here. So this part is where we want to make sure that these are centered up so that we sew directly through that little point, a 1/4 inch seam. So we're going to line these up, and then I like to pin once right here, and then if you want to, you can also pin at each side as well. And then again on this side, I flip it so that it's easy for me to insert the pin, but you'll see we have the same fabric touching each other here, and then pin that in place like so. So now we have our pieces pinned. The next thing I'm going to do is actually go through the entire stack that I have here and do that same process, getting all of our center pieces pinned up with their corresponding Flying Geese and corner pieces of background fabric. Once you have pinned all your pieces and matched them all up, we're ready to take them over to the sewing machine and get started sewing our blocks together. Now you'll see I have my whole big stack nice and ready to go. You can go ahead and sew all of these at once sitting using a chain sewing method. I'm just going to do a few to show you the basics, and then I'll come back later and finish them up. But I'll grab my first piece and make sure that it's still nice and lined up straight. I already stitched on my leader here, so I have my little scrap of fabric holding the threads back, and I'm actually using pink thread today because I know that that's what's going to hide the best with these center pieces. So when I go to sew this piece together, that pink thread is going to blend in really well, and I don't really like changing out my thread color all that often. So that's what I'm doing. That's my approach. Feel free to do whatever works best for you. But you'll also see that I have my 1/4 inch foot on because I'll be sewing a 1/4 inch seam. And we'll go ahead and just get started. Now after you sew that first seam, you can snip off your leader back here and take our pin out as well. And then I'll just sew the next piece. And next up we have that center row. I will sew that one as well. Now you can go ahead and sew your entire stack all the way through, but I'll just pretend that I did, and next I'll stitch on my ender, snip the thread, and then snip these pieces apart. And then we will flip these pieces over and we'll sew the opposite side. We already have them all pinned, so it's easy to keep going. As you're sewing this seam, I didn't say this earlier, but this is important. Right where the background fabric meets your star colored fabric, that's where you want the needle to go through, right at that little point there. It should be right at a 1/4 inch because that's how we trimmed our flying geese, but it's a nice little way to check right here as we're sewing. And when you get to the end, we will trim our pieces apart, and then we're ready to go press them. Now, before we start actually pressing our pieces, I like to set the seam with my nice hot iron. Just getting those seams nice and crisp. And now we have a few choices to make. Now, if you've followed along for a while, you might know that I like to press most of my seams open, so you can press these seams open as well. However, I'll show you an option for nesting your seams. So if you are going to nest your seams, you can follow the arrows in the pattern, or you can follow me here. I'm going to press the top and the bottom rows towards that background square. So you'll see here, I'll press these this direction, and then I'll press that center row towards the mid piece. And that's going to give us the opportunity to nest our seams when we sew our top and bottom and middle rows all together. So that's what I'll do here. I'll start off with just one piece, pressing away from the flying geese. And doing the same option on the other row. And then our center block will press towards the Scrappy Hourglass unit. Once all 6 of those seams are pressed nice and flat to the correct side, we can go ahead and line our pieces up again to show what they will look like as a star. So you can see here again, I've pressed these seams out towards the background and I pressed these seams in towards the center. So now when we go to line these units up, we have our seams nice and nesting. And I showed you that step as well when we were doing our center units. So if you liked how that worked, you can do that again on this step. And I'll go ahead and pin these seams in place so that when we go to sew them, they're nice and crisp. And then repeat for the opposite row. And then you repeat that entire step for all of the star blocks that you're making. And next we'll go ahead and take this back over to our sewing machine. Now we're ready to sew our final 2 seams. Again, I have the leader all ready behind my needle and I'm ready to just go ahead and get sewing. Once I get it a little bit down, I'll clip off that. Be really careful as you get close to where the seams connect to make sure that you don't get any fabric overturned. A nice steady seam straight and then go through that little point so that you get that nice crisp point of your star. Again, this is the part where you want to be really careful to make sure that that seam on the bottom doesn't get tucked backwards. You want it to be facing the correct direction. And if you're doing a bunch at once, you could chain sew your entire stack, or you can just take your ender and then grab your block and twist it around so that we can sew the alternate seam. Again, this is where you want to be careful. Make sure that that seam gets tucked going the proper direction. And next we'll take this over to our ironing board again. Now before we start pressing our unit, I like to set the seam on both sides. And then I will press these seams open, but you could also press these to the side if you wanted to. But I'll show you pressing them open. I like to open them with my fingers and do a little finger press. And then come in behind it with the hot iron. Now once you've pressed your seams, I also like to flip the entire unit over and press from the top of the block. And then to make the block as extra crisp, I'll add a little bit of best press on top. Totally optional, but I like it because I think it makes the adding the borders piece a little bit easier. Now once you're done pressing your block and it's nice and crisp, you are done with your block. Now there is one final optional step I'll share with you today, is squaring up your block. Now because we are adding sashing and borders to this quilt, it's not as essential as if it would be if we weren't adding the sashing. However, we want to make sure that these blocks are 12.5 inches square. They should be pretty close if you sewed nice, straight, even seams. However, we all know that that's not always the case. So go ahead and lay your block out flat and use a 12.5-inch square ruler like this one. And you can check and make sure, see if everything's squared up and see if it's actually 12.5 inches. You can use the 1/4-inch dots on your ruler to check in and see if those points of your star are right at that 1/4-inch mark. If your block is bigger than 12.5 inches, then go ahead and use your rotary cutter to trim off just a little sliver of any excess without cutting into that star or the 1/4 inch that you're going to want as seam allowance for your star. So if you have a little bit of a wonky block, you can go ahead and trim it down just a little bit to get it a little bit more precise. As I mentioned, that's an optional step. I personally don't do that step, but as you want to get your blocks more perfect, that's an option that you might want to try out and just test it and see what your blocks look like compared to the 12.5-inch ruler. I hope you have so much fun making your star quilt blocks this week. Once you have all of your star blocks made, I'll see you back here next week for lesson 6. During lesson 6, we'll take our sashing and borders and add those in between our blocks to make our finished quilt top. So I cannot wait to get started on that with you so very soon. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can drop a comment here, over on Patreon, or even send me an email at homemadeemilyjane@gmail.com. Good luck making your star quilt blocks this week. Happy sewing!